Hello everyone. Is my voice audible, guys? Is my voice audible?
Yes.
So, how many of you have completed that task, timer task? Can I know in the chat how many of you done? So, task was very simple, right? So, you have to just create a timer. Initially, you have to show the count as 0. You should have 3 buttons. Start, stop, and clear. These are the 3 buttons we wanted to clear. If you click on start, timer should start. For every 1 second, this count should change. If you click on stop, then that timer should stop. Again, if you click on start, where you have stopped, from there only it should start. If you click on clear, again it should come back to 0. It should come back to 0. So how many of you done? There is no response means no one have completed that task.
I have done little bit.
In which, in both JavaScript and React.
In both I did, but React I did. I feel it's a bit better, but JavaScript I could not do it well.
Oh, anybody else, guys? Only one person do. Oh. So let me come back here. Let me create one simple component here, timer component. And simply I'm adding here h2. Timer value is initially I want to keep it as a 0. Here is 3 buttons: start, stop, clear. Okay. Now here, if you want, you can just add some styles. Just adding some basic styles. So let's see how it looks. So for this, I will go back to app.jsx. I will import here timer component. And here simply I will render that timer component. If I save it, and if I go back to my browser, let me run. So here we got this timer. Let's see, this box shadow is not applied.
Color is black. Sure.
Black spelling. Now we got it. Now let me add padding as well. Here we got it. Okay. So here I wanted to show some count. Right now, if I hard code it, if I keep it 0, it will be like this. So this value is going to change for every 1 second. So any data which is going to change on your screen, that data should come from state. That data should come from state. So what I will do here, simply I will create one state. For that, I have to import use state. Let count, or I will say timer, comma set timer equals to use state. And initially I want value should be 0. Now this timer state I will bind here. So here we got it. Now what is our requirement? The moment we click on this button, for every 1 second, this count value should change. When this count value should change after every 1 second, once we click on this button. So for that, we will add on click event listener to this start button. And whenever click event gets triggered on this button, we want to call one function like start timer. Now we don't have this function, so we have to define this function. So somewhere here, I will define that function. Const start timer. Now, what is our requirement? For every 1 second or for every second, this count should change. For every second, count should change. For every second, if count should change means internally for every second, you have to update this timer state. For every second, you have to update this timer state. To update this timer state for every second, what we have to do, we have to call this function set timer. Set timer function we have to call for every second. Continuously, you have to call this set timer for every second. So how can we call set timer for every second? Continuously for every second, I want to call this set timer. How can I call it? What I need to do here? After every 1 second, I need to call this set timer. Continuously, it should be the continuous process until unless I stop it. So for this, which function I need to use?
Set interval.
So this is where set interval will come into picture. So inside this start timer, we will call our set interval. Now set interval function takes two arguments. The first argument is a callback function. Second argument is your time in milliseconds. Suppose here, if I am adding 1000 milliseconds, so 1000 milliseconds equals to 1 second. So what this set interval will do, it will call this callback function for every 1 second until unless you stop it. Once you call set interval, internally what set interval will do, it will call this callback function for every 1 second. Whatever time you will mention here, After that time, it will call this callback function. And it will be like a continuous process. For every 1 second now, this callback function will be called until unless you stop it. And whenever you call set interval, once you call set interval, this set interval is going to return some ID to us. It will return one ID to us, one random ID it will return. If you want that ID, you can hold in one variable. Let's assume that here I am creating one variable, something called timer ID. And whatever ID it will return, that ID I will hold inside this variable called timer ID. So remember, set interval will return one ID. That ID will be useful for us to stop the calling of this callback function or to stop the timer. Now, inside this callback function, I can call set a timer. Set a timer. Now, whenever you call set a timer inside this callback function, now what happens whenever you click on this button? Start timer function will be called. This function will be called. Internally, this function will call set interval. Now, set interval will call this callback function for every 1 second. And this callback function internally, it will call the set timer. It means our set timer will be called for every 1 second. And what we wanted to do inside this set timer, we want to update our timer. So whatever current timer value is there, to that I want to add one. I want to add one. Now, if I write like this, our code will not work. See, just check here. Now, if I click on start, it is 1. Now it is stopping at 1 only. It is not moving forward. Anybody knows why it is not moving forward? See, the moment I click on start, I got 1.
Plus,
Why it is not moving?
We got to apply condition, right?
Which condition? Now, the first we have to understand why this count is not increasing. Why it increased only one time? It should be a continuous process. Now, if you see here if I add console.log and if I say working, now if you observe this console.log will execute multiple times. If I go back to the inspect console and if I click on start, see, continuously this working is getting printed. But our count is not increasing.
inner HTML should increase of timer.
What we have to increase?
Set timer we got to assign in
In-
one variable, then we got to keep increase that variable.
No. See,
The
set
use state
timer
is
is
an
calling multiple times.
asynchronous. I think that use state is asynchronous something method. I think.
Mhm.
I think we
Ex-
are setting it to timer ID, which is a local value, which will get reset by
See,
the state value
first
is
try
taken
to
away.
understand when timer will get updated. When timer will get updated? If you call set timer. Am I right? Timer should get updated whenever set timer will be called. Now here you are calling set timer multiple times. It is calling multiple times, but still your value is 1 only here. How we can prove that set timer is calling multiple values? by seeing this line getting executed. If you see console.log is getting executed continuously, it means this line also getting executed multiple times, but still our result is here one only. Answer is
Um,
one.
we need to assign the value to iter and need to increase the count
We have to assign value.
to header timer equal to 0. We have initially assigned, right? I
Yes.
think in paragraph or header that we need to increase.
So here first time whenever you call set timer, so your value will be 0 plus 1. So timer value is 1. Then again if you call, it should be 1 plus 1.
UI is not rendering. Maybe we need to take one more
Now, if you
state,
call set timer, UI will get rendered, right?
but that is maybe due to is inside the set interval.
So let's try here. I will add console.log of timer and let me check whether timer value is getting updated or not. What is my timer value? It's 0 only.
Until we stop the timer, we have to increase, sir. So we have to use any other command like wait or something.
Here, to resolve this problem, simply pass updater function. This is where updater function will come into picture. Now just see.
Oh.
Now your account is getting increased.
Mhm.
Set the time. Okay. So here you have pass updater function to resolve this problem. Now so your count is increasing for every 1 second. Now my requirement is if I click on this stop, this current value should stop. So how to clear your set interval? Anybody knows?
Clear interval.
So whenever I click on this on click, I want to call a function called stop timer. Here I will define one more function, const stop timer. Now inside this, we have to call a function called clear interval. So whenever you want to stop your set interval, then you have to call here clear interval. Now to this clear interval, we have to pass the ID. This ID we have to pass. So here I am passing that ID. Now do you think that code will work?
We need to set timer to null, right? 0.
Set timer to, why set
Yeah.
timer to 0? I want my
Okay.
count should stop here. If I click here, then it should stop at 104 only. If I make set timer 0, then here the value will be 0. I don't want to make it this value as 0. I want to stop that count here itself. Now if I click on start, my count is started. Suppose at 3, I clicked on stop, then at 3 only it should stop. It should not be 0. That is my requirement. But if you see here, your stop will not work. If I click on start, this count is increasing continuously, but stop will not work. Now, why stop is not working? Because this code is absolutely right. Whatever we have written, it's come right only. But there is some issue here. What is that issue? If you want to stop calling of this callback function, then you have to call clear interval. And to that clear interval, you have to pass your ID. Whatever ID this set interval will return, that ID we have to pass. Then this clear interval will stop calling of this callback function. Nothing but it will simply clear your interval. So that execution of this callback function will stop. But here we are doing the same thing. We are calling the clear interval, and to that clear interval, we are passing the timer ID. But still, our code is not working. I'm clicking on the stop, but see, it is not stopping. Anybody knows why it is not stopping?
On the button, we have to call this function. So on click.
You have called, right? On click,
Stop
we are
timer.
calling stop timer, and internally stop timer is calling clear interval, and here we are passing the timer ID. See, the
Still
problem
not
is whenever you call set a timer, what set a timer will do? It will update your timer,
increase.
and then what it will do? It will re-render your component. The moment your component gets re-rendered, this variable will be recreated. The moment this variable is recreated, whatever ID you are storing in this variable, that ID you will use. So this set interval is going to return some ID. That ID is required to clear interval. But what happens whenever we call set a timer, it is updating our timer and it is re-rendering the component. The moment your component get re-rendered, you are losing that ID. Now, once you lose that ID, you cannot clear that interval. You cannot clear that interval. So somehow, whatever ID this set interval is returning, we should not lose that ID. So we have to save that ID at some place so that whenever we required, we can use that ID to clear our interval. But due to re-rendering, this variable is getting recreated. And due to that, we are losing that ID. We are losing the ID. So I should not store that ID in the normal variable. It is not a right approach. Now, if I am not storing that ID in the normal variable, then what is the another solution? Another solution is, if you want, you can create one more state. So I can create like this one state, timer ID, comma, set timer ID equals to use state. Now, whatever set interval is going to return ID, that ID somehow I need to store here. So can you tell me how we can store the ID returned by set interval into this timer ID state? This set interval is going to return some ID. That ID somehow I want to store inside this state. How I can store it?
Can we take one more local variable in start timer and set it to set timer ID.
Mhm. Any other way? First, understand how can you update this timer ID? How to update the value in the timer ID?
Using set timer.
Using set timer ID, right? Now to set a timer ID, whatever value you will pass, that value will get updated here. Am I right? And we know that this set interval will return some ID. It will return some value. So can we do one thing? This set interval, can we call inside this set timer ID? Inside this set timer ID, can we call that set interval?
Yes.
Because set interval is going to return something, whatever it will return, it will be given to set timer ID. Set timer ID will update inside the timer. So I will remove this slide. Save it. Now let's see whether it will work or not. I will click on start. It is starting. I will click on stop. It stop. Again, I will click on start. It is starting from there only. That is what we wanted. If I click on stop, it will stop. Now, if I click on clear, it should get back to 0. So that is straightforward, right? I want my count value should be 0. So whenever I click on click, I will just set reset timer. I will go back here, create one more function, const reset timer. Now here what I need to do, I want to make this count value 0. So what code I have to write here? This value, this timer value, I want to make it 0. So what code I need to write?
Set timer to 0.
Yeah, that's it. Set timer. I have to make it to 0. So if I go back here, if I click on this clear, it is 0. Again, if I click on start, starting from 1. If I click on stop, stop. If I click on clear, clear. Again, if I click on start, starting from 1. It is working. It is working fine the way we want. But there is one problem here. What is that problem means? Now we have created one state, that is timer ID. Whatever data we are storing in this timer ID, are we showing that data on our screen anywhere? We have created one state called timer ID. Inside this, we are storing some ID value. So that ID value, are we showing anywhere on the screen?
No.
No. If you are not showing any data on the screen, such data you should not store inside the state. That is
Okay.
the rule of your state. Yesterday I have told you, right? If there is any data which you are not showing on the screen, that data you should not store inside the state. Why we should not store inside this state? Because if you update this timer ID, then your component will re-render. And if you are not showing any data on the screen, then re-rendering is not required. Re-rendering is not required. When re-rendering is required, if you want to update any value on the screen. Now, if you are not showing any value on the screen, then why we should re-render our component? There is no sense to re-render our component. Guys, on the mute. It doesn't make any kind of sense to re-render our component if we are not showing any particular data on the screen. That's why this approach is invalid approach. It's an invalid. Now we cannot use state. Now we cannot use state also. Now we cannot use normal variable also. If you use normal variable, the problem is whenever you re-render the component, value will be lost, or value will be lost.
Re-rendering the component means when we are clicking the button, uh, if the counter is 1, it is increasing. Is it that?
Re-rendering means you're updating it, right? Timer ID. Whenever timer ID is getting updated, your component will re-render. Nothing but this function will be recalled.
For every 1 second, it is
Not for
increasing.
every 1 second, only once. Whenever you are updating this timer ID. When your timer ID is updating, first time, whenever you call set interval, it returns one ID value. At that time, this timer ID will get called. Only one time it will re-render. But that one time also we want to restrict. So the problem is, if you go with normal variable and if you re-render the component, value will be lost. And if you go for state, now inside the state, we should not store the data. Which we are not showing on the screen. Why? Because it will trigger re-rendering, which we don't require. This point is very, very important to understand. In your interviews, they will ask why you are not using state. Now, if you say that I am not using state because this data I am not showing on the screen. And if I am not showing on the screen, if my timer gets updated, timer ID gets updated, unnecessarily my component will re-render. And if my component is getting re-rendered unnecessarily, it will affect the performance. It will affect the performance of my application. Guys, give me 1 minute. Yeah. So just see here. Here we are calling this set timer ID, right? We are calling this set timer ID to update this timer ID. So whenever this set timer ID is called, your timer ID is getting updated, plus your component is getting re-rendered. Now this timer ID, we are not showing anywhere on the screen. If you are not showing that timer ID anywhere on the screen, then it doesn't make any kind of sense to re-render your component. So like this, if you are unnecessarily re-rendering your component, then it will affect the performance of your application. It will affect the performance of your application. That is the reason whenever you are using state, then you have to be very, very careful, because whenever you update state, your component will get re-rendered. And whenever your component gets re-rendered, then there should not be effect on the performance of your application. So you have to make sure re-rendering should have a proper reason. Unnecessarily, we should not re-render our component. Now here, if you are not showing any data on this screen, then re-rendering doesn't make any kind of sense. That is the reason it is recommended that if you are not showing any data on the screen, don't store such data inside the state variable. Why we should not store inside the state variable? If you update your state variable due to some action, then unnecessarily your component will get re-rendered. And unnecessarily, if you're re-rendering the components, then it might affect the performance of your application. That's why state is not recommended at this particular use case. We cannot go with normal variable also. Why? Because whenever our component gets re-rendered, we are losing the data. Then what is the solution? Where should I store that ID value? Where to store the ID value? So that we cannot, where to store the ID value, so that we should not lose the ID value on re-rendering of the component, and whenever we update ID value, then component should not get re-rendered. So we have to find a place where we can store that ID value, so that you should not lose that ID value on re-rendering of your component. And if you update that ID value, your component should not re-render. Your component should not re-render. So for this, React came with one more solution. That is, they have given us one special value where, one special reference where we can store the value. It gave us a special reference where we can store the data. Whatever data you will store in this special reference, that data will not be lost on re-rendering of your component. Whenever your component gets re-rendered, you will not lose the data if you store your data inside that special reference. Plus, if you update the data inside this special reference, then your component will not re-render. Your component will not re-render. And that special reference we can create using one more hook called useRef. There is a hook called useRef. So whenever you call useRef hook, this hook is going to return one object. It will return one object. In that object, you will have only one property whose key name is current. And to this current property, we can store some data as a value. Here we can store some data as a value. Whatever data you are going to store here, whatever data you will store here, that data will not be lost, or you will not lose that data whenever your component gets re-rendered. Plus, if you want this data, you can update the way we update our normal object property value. If you want, you can update this value as well whenever you want. And whenever you update this value, your component will not re-render. Your component will not re-render. So now what we can do is our timer ID, whatever timer ID is there, that timer ID we can store here. So once you store your timer ID here, then that ID will not be lost. That ID will not be lost whenever your component gets re-rendered. And if you are not losing your timer ID, then if you want to clear your interval, then you can clear that interval using this ID whenever you want. So for this, now instead of creating like this state, I don't want to create state. So if you are not creating state, we don't require this set timer as well. Now here we will import a hook called useRef. Now whenever you import this useRef, you can call that useRef hook here. If you call this hook is going to return one object. So you can hold that object in some variable. I will simply say here timer ID. Now this is the object. So internally, timer ID is a object. In that object, there is a property called current. So there is only one property, that is current. And if you are not, by default, here the value will be undefined. Now, if you want to update the value, so simply you can update using your normal object approach. You can say timer ID dot current equals to whatever new value you want to update. So this is how we can update the value of this current property. Now, what we need to do, whenever this set interval is going to return some ID, that ID we need to store here. So for this, simply I can say here timer ID dot current equals to set interval. Now this set interval, whatever ID it will return, that ID will be assigned to this current property. Now, whenever we click on this stop button, we are calling stop timer. Stop timer is calling clear interval. And inside this, we have to pass that ID. How to access that ID? Timer ID dot current. Now, if you come back here, there will be no change in the functionality. So it is working. If I click on stop, it is stop. Again, if I click on start, again, if I click on stop, stop. If I click on clear, clear. Again, if I click on start, it is start. So the advantage of this use ref is whenever we call this use ref, it returns one object. In that object, you will have exactly one property and whose key name is current. To that property, we can store some data as a value. Whatever data you will store inside this object, that data you will not lose on re-rendering of your component. If your component is re-rendering 100 times or any number of times, you will not lose that data. Plus, if you want, you can update that data whenever you want. How to update? For that, you have to follow your normal object approach. You have to follow normal object approach. And whenever you update the value of this current property, your component will not re-render. Your component will not re-render. So updation of this current value property will not trigger re-rendering. It will not trigger re-rendering. So this is where your use ref hook comes into picture. So one of the use case of use ref is we can store the data which we don't want to lose on re-rendering of the component. So what is use ref? Use ref is a hook in React. Whenever we call use ref hook, it returns one object. It returns one object. It returns one object. And that object contains only one property. Only one property. That is current property. If you want, you can store some data here. So useRef is a hook in React. It is a hook in React. Whenever we call useRef hook, it returns one object, and that object contains only one property, that is current property. That is current property. It means whenever you call useRef, it's going to return one object. Will return one object. And inside that object, whatever data you want, you can store it. If we want, we can update the value of current property any number of times. And updation of current property value will not trigger re-rendering. Will not trigger re-rendering. Will not trigger re-rendering. Understood? What is useRef? What it returns? How we can store the data inside that useRef current property. Let me know if you have any doubts in this. Now, if you come back to yesterday's example, so let me comment this timer now. Here, have you remembered this example? So whenever I click on display, it will display the initial value of my state, that is null, data state, that is null, variable value is undefined. I will update my variable value. Again, I will click on display. So let me clear this. I will click on display. Still my state value is null because we did not updated state. Data is null because we did not updated data state also, but we have updated normal variable to 500. So that got printed. Now I will click on update state. The moment I click on update state, my state got updated. Now whenever my state gets updated, my component will re-render. Due to re-rendering, we will lose the data of normal variable. Right now, variable value was 500. After updating the state, now let's see what is the variable data. If I click on display, state got 100, but variable is undefined. Why we got undefined? Because we lost that data of variable due to re-rendering. Now I don't want to lose the data due to re-rendering. So instead of storing the data inside the normal variable, so I can go to that ref. Yeah, here. Now, instead of storing the data inside like this normal variable, what we can do is we can create current property using this useRef. So I can have let data equals to use, or instead of data, I will say that info equals to useRef. Now we know that useRef is going to return one object. That object we are storing inside the info. And in that object, there is only one property, that is current property. By default, value will be undefined. If you want, you can assign some default value here. How to assign a default value? For that, simply you have to pass your default value as a first argument to use ref. Here, if I am passing hello, then this hello will be assigned to this current property as a value. Now this info, nothing but this current value, I want to console. So I will go back here. Here simply I will say that info dot current. So what is the default value we are storing here? The default value is hello. And whenever I click on update value, here I just want to update the value of that object. So how to update? Info dot current equals to some value I will update here. I will say welcome. Now if I go back here, if I refresh, now if I click on display, now see state value is null, data value is null, variable value is hello. Now if I click on update value, and again if I click on display, now here state value is null, data value is null, but variable value became welcome. Now I will click on update state. The moment I click on update state, my state got updated. Let me clear all this. Again, I will click on display. If I click on display, my state value is 100. My variable value is still welcome. Now it's not undefined. It's still welcome. Again, if I click on update data and click on display, here I got state 100, data 100. Still my variable value is welcome. It means we are not losing that data. Why we are not losing that data? Because we have stored that data inside the use ref. That is the reason we are not losing that data now. So any data which you don't want to show on the screen, and that data you don't want to lose on re-rendering of your component, such data you can store inside the current property as a value. You can store inside the current property as a value, which is returned by use ref hook. Use ref hook. So the point what you have to understand is this one. So data which we don't want to lose on re-rendering of the component, and that data if you are not showing on this screen, such data you can store as a value inside the current property. So you should know which data you should store in this state, which data you have to store in this use ref, and which data you have to store in the normal variable. So that part you should be able to judge. So depending upon the scenario, you have to decide where your data should be stored. Inside the state, or inside the current property as a value, or inside the normal variable. So depending upon the requirement, we have to decide it. Yeah, any doubts up to here, guys? Understood what is use ref, why we are storing the data in the use ref, how to store the data in the use ref, how to update the data of the use ref. Let me know on the chat.
Here data state also no need to use state, right?
If you are not showing data on this screen, don't use state. Simple rule. If you are not showing any data on this screen, don't store that data in this state. So you should have the answers for all this. What is useRef? How to store the data in the current property as the value of useRef? How to update current property value? Component gets re-rendered or not on updating value of current property. And when to store the data inside the current property value. That point also you should know. When to store the data in the current property value. Okay. Yeah. That's all guys from my end. If you have any doubts, let me know. If you don't have any doubts, you guys can drop. Let's join tomorrow and let's understand one more use case of useRef. One of the use cases to store the data. There is one more use case of useRef. There is one more use of useRef. What is that? That we will explore in tomorrow's session.